Okay, hello everyone. In this week's lecture, we have two extremely important and significant figures, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, to discuss because I have a lot to say about both of the texts that I asked you to read. I won't say too much about their biographies. I would encourage you to read the introductory material before Up From Slavery and The Souls of Black Folk, because that will help to contextualize these figures. But I think I'll start with Booker T. Washington. Again, as a child, he was a slave. And as you can see from reading a couple of chapters from Up From Slavery, it had, as one would imagine, a rather profound influence and impact on his life. And it also helps to inform some of his thoughts and feelings about what racial equality should look like, how to achieve those goals. And again, at times, the means to that end is in fundamental and stark contrast to a figure like W.E.B. Du Bois. But I wanted to start by just identifying some broad themes from Up From Slavery, and you should perhaps write down these, and it's something you could return to, especially for a short response or an essay. Slavery, not slaveholders, as the problem. He says, for example, on page 702, that everyone was an unfortunate victim of slavery. And I'll return to this because it's important. This notion that there is not a single capital V villain, but instead it's more nebulous, it's more abstract. It's the concept that is slavery itself. And there are times when Washington, in effect, suggests that white slave holders, the very individuals who not only brutalized him, but brutalized his race, they were victims too. And that can be, at times, quite difficult to read and quite difficult to hear, because we have this sense, and I think Du Bois certainly thinks this, we have this sense that there are clear heroes and clear villains in this conflict, or there are the villains and there are the victims. And for someone like Washington to suggest, well, on some level, slavery has victimized all of us, is quite a provocative thing to say, but it certainly does fit within this larger tradition of attempting to placate white, almost exclusively Southern, former slave holders, again, in an attempt to achieve or realize this larger goal of racial equality. You'll also notice repeatedly in Up From Slavery, for Washington, not only the joy of work, but how work has this way of producing a kind of ethical attitude for the worker, but just the sense that work has an ethics to it, the ethics of work. And this is part of how he when I said just a moment ago, for someone like Washington, slavery, it's something that on some level victimizes everyone, both slave and slaveholder. This is part of how he gets to that argument, or part of how he develops that argument by speaking so fondly and positively of work. But I'll return to that later. Education, of course, is extremely important, and this is something within this tradition of slave narratives. This is something, for example, if you've read Frederick Douglass, is quite visible. Just the way the slave within these narratives fights for, celebrates, and lionizes education. And education as this vehicle to bigger, grander things, and as just something that creates the conditions for any one of us, black, white, slave, non-slave, the way education creates the possibility for imagining different worlds, etc. And for someone like Frederick Douglass, for example, there are many times in his first narrative on his escape from slavery where one of his master's wives, or his master's brother's wife, for a time taught him to read, and her husband in effect said, I'm summarizing, if we teach them to read, they'll start to realize this situation we have put them in, or the degree of subjugation they experience. So this is a theme that not only Washington returns to, but many writers within this tradition utilize the importance of education. But I think what you'll also notice with someone like Washington is just how at times optimistic he is. And once again, this is all very much part of this genre, this sense that we must be optimistic. We, the former slave, writing these slave narratives or these escape narratives, these stories and literature that attempt to, at times covertly, but at other times overtly, encode particular messages about the need for abolition, or after the abolishment of slavery, the need for equal rights and the need for racial equality in the United States. This sense of optimism, of course, has this larger rhetorical purpose because there are these larger goals that almost all of these texts have embedded in them. Again, at times quite overt and quite visible to us as the reader, but at times it's more covert. It's maybe not as visible, and we as the reader need to do a bit of digging to see it. But again, just that overarching sense of optimism is quite prevalent in these sorts of texts. And we also see with someone like Washington this emphasis on self-reliance. And I'll come back to this a bit later, but self-reliance as a notion and a concept was quite popular. Of course, it still remains quite popular. My God, it's one of those indelible, it seems, American ideas. But it's something that became, or gained some traction, a lot of traction, in fact, in the 19th century, especially with transcendentalist writers such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. So again, the power of the individual relying upon oneself matters obviously to a figure like Booker T. Washington if you pay attention, but also the importance and the necessity of economic stability and material stability. And this is one of the places where we can see a clear schism between Washington and Dubois. Now, of course, that's not to say or suggest that for Booker T. Washington, economic and material stability matters. And of course, it doesn't for Dubois, because that's just not true. But the way both of those thinkers and figures conceptualize the place, or how they prioritize economic and material stability, especially in relation to other things such as the right to vote, access to free and fair voting opportunities. There are clear differences, or Washington, he has a different set of priorities than a figure like Dubois, which is, again, one of the main, or one of the more significant schisms between the two of them. And finally, and I mentioned this earlier, Washington is often described as an incrementalist, or if you are perhaps less favorable to him, an accommodationist. And the tension between this incrementalist accommodationist approach and perhaps something more aggressive, something non-accommodationist. And basically, the contours of this conflict or the contours of this division, it's really about how to relate to and how to advocate for racial equality when confronted by a white majority that might be less inclined to offer those rights, or a white majority that might be skeptical of even the necessity of those rights. And for someone like Washington, he's thinking particularly and writing particularly about white, almost exclusively Southern, former slave owners. And as the term itself implies, or as the term suggests, accommodationist or incrementalist, and I'll talk about the differences between the two, for someone like Washington, he is perhaps more interested in achieving these goals and the ends of all of this work for racial equality. He's more interested in doing so over perhaps a longer period of time. Or if you wanted to be generous to a figure like Washington, you might say that, well, he's just realistic. He's pragmatic. He understands that very little, if any, changes in a day. And if we accept that premise, how do we then behave? Whereas a figure like Dubois, and this is not to suggest that Dubois is somehow naive, or that he doesn't understand that change is much slower than we would want it to be, because he certainly is. But Dubois is a figure who is quite clear and quite unambiguous about how, if we do not ask for what we want, especially at the beginning, it's entirely possible that we will never get what we want, which is precisely why figures like Dubois later accused Washington of a kind of accommodationism, which is to say that he was far less interested in seeing and recognizing the needs of his community. And whether he intended to or not, he was far more interested in placating this white majority. And again, that's another divide or schism between these two. What does it look like for us to advocate and agitate for what we want, what we think and believe is right? Do we try to do this piecemeal, or do we simply not mince words and just say what we want and advocate and agitate aggressively for what we want? And again, I'll explore this in more detail later, but I think I want to identify a couple of important moments from slavery. Again, feels more like a narrative than the Du Bois piece, and that's partially a genre consideration, because for someone like Washington, he's writing something that feels more autobiographical. It feels more like a memoir. But with Du Bois, and part of this, it's not just his education, but it's also how he wants to approach some of the questions and how he wants to develop some of the questions that he at times explicitly asks, but at other times implicitly asks, which is why Du Bois's text feels far more like a sociological, perhaps even a scientific or an historical text, whereas Washington's is far more about just the power of his personal narrative as a way or a means of speaking to some of these issues. And I think we see the power of narrative in the opening paragraph. And we learned that Washington was born on a plantation in Franklin County, Virginia. But he then immediately tells us, quote, I am not quite sure of the exact place or exact date of my birth, but at any rate, I suspect I must have been born somewhere and at some point. He's quite funny as well. But then if you look down a couple of paragraphs, he writes, of my ancestry, I know almost nothing. In the slave quarters, and even later, I heard whispered conversations among the colored people of the tortures which the slaves, including no doubt my ancestors on my mother's side, suffered in the middle passage of the slave ship while being conveyed from Africa to America. And I think what he establishes here, and this is quite subtle, but he communicates some of the perhaps less visible horrors of slavery. Because when we think about, and part of this is because of media representations in film and television, when we think about the horrors of slavery, we think about what slavery and what chattel slavery in particular in the United States did to the black body. But I want you to notice, and it's not that Washington doesn't address this, because he does. Think, for example, about the flax shirt. But I think what he wants us to understand here is that slavery also has this effect of rendering the slave void in some way, because Washington tells us that he doesn't actually know where he was born, and he doesn't even know when he was born. He just knows that he was born. And we also learn that he knows so little about his ancestry. And there's a reason why. And it's not because his family kept poor records. It's because he was born into an institution that thought of him as a piece of property, as a machine, as a tool, and not a human being. Because we don't necessarily keep detailed records about our phones and when they were born, right? I don't know where my phone was made necessarily. I suspect you don't either. And part of the reason why is because it's just a tool. Even the idea that it has a birthday would seem quite strange. And that helps to perhaps in part explain the horrors, not just the physical horrors, but the psychological and the communal horrors of slavery. Because when you are nothing more than a tool and a machine, you're treated as such. And for someone like Washington, that means he's left to construct or piece together his identity from, at times, a collection of disparate threads. And I think that's just an important thing that he wants to acknowledge here at the beginning of Up From Slavery. Not just the physical depravity or the way slavery inflicts these horrors upon the black body, but some of the more subtle psychological, emotional, and communal horrors, like this feeling that you don't know, this sense of just being adrift and not knowing how you came into this world, not understanding where you came from. All of that for someone like Washington is part of the horrors of slavery. Now, from here, and I mentioned this earlier, I think it's important to talk about how Washington, or the way he locates the problems, or again, as I mentioned before, who the heroes are and who the villains are in a society that endorses slavery. And one of his larger points, and he introduces this early in Up From Slavery, is it's not necessarily any particular individual. It's the idea. It's the institution. And this is on the bottom of page 702. And he's writing in reference to this moment when his mother stole. And this is what he writes. But taking place at the time it did, and for the reason that it did, no one could ever make me believe that my mother was guilty of thieving. She was simply a victim of the system of slavery. I cannot remember having slept in a bed until after our family was declared free by the Emancipation Proclamation. But taking place at the time it did, and for the reason that it did, no one could ever make me believe that my mother was guilty of thieving. She was simply a victim of the system of slavery. And pay close attention to Washington's words. The system of slavery. This is, again, something he develops throughout the text, but he introduces it here to make an important distinction. Within this system, or within this institution, the normal rules perhaps don't apply, and we should always have that caveat in mind when we attempt to assess whether someone behaves correctly or incorrectly. And I think what this also does, it speaks to just how, again, Washington's understanding of what the real problem is. And for someone like Washington to focus on or to dwell on the actions of particular individuals frankly misses the point. We need to put those actions into a proper context. And if you look ahead a couple of pages at the bottom of 706, we see how he also wants to clearly contextualize the behavior of Southern white people. This is at the bottom of the page. He writes, I pity from the bottom of my heart any nation or body of people that is so unfortunate as to get entangled in the net of slavery. I have long since ceased to cherish any spirit of bitterness against the Southern white people on account of the enslavement of my race. No one section of our country was wholly responsible for its introduction, and besides, it was recognized and protected for years by the general government. And I would encourage you to pause over this and seriously consider what Washington means, because for him to say he, quote, has long since ceased to cherish any spirit of bitterness against the Southern white people on account of the enslavement of my race. We as readers are perhaps wondering, well, how could you ever, considering your experiences and considering the totality of the violence that his race experienced, how could he ever arrive at this place? And for Washington, it's precisely because of how he understands the responsibility or the lack of responsibility that any single individual or any group of people has. For him, it's not as easy to just point a finger at one person or one group. This is far bigger than that. And for many of my students, and even for a figure like Dubois, there's something potentially troubling about this because, and I'm just offering one way of reading this, you could read this as an apology of sorts, that perhaps he's apologizing for or behaving as an apologist for former white slaveholders. Now, I would argue, and I think Washington would do the same, whether he believes this or not, his larger point seems to be, if we want to get what we want, if we want to realize the vision of racial equality, antagonizing a white majority that still retains so much power, not just material power, but political power, doing so may potentially hinder our efforts. And perhaps the best thing we can do is to soften how we understand who's responsible and the level and degree of guilt that we may attribute to former slave owners and former slave holders. Now, I'll leave it to you to decide how you feel about this, because once again, just to establish maybe some of the ways you could respond, you could think, well, sure, I understand what he wants to accomplish in a moment like this, but at some point, it may have a negative effect, or being overly apologetic like this, if you wanted to read it that way, may not necessarily create the conditions to accomplish the sorts of goals someone like Washington clearly wants to accomplish. Or you may read this as, again, a rather shrewd and pragmatic approach to a rather difficult, challenging, and sticky situation, right? Washington and his race, after the abolition of slavery in 1865, were in a rather precarious position on a myriad of different fronts. They did not have the material and institutional advantages that their white counterparts had. Reconstruction lasted for approximately 12 years. And while there were certainly gains made between 1865 and 1877, they were practically erased. And for many scholars of this period, they argue things somehow were even worse after the dissolution of Reconstruction in 1877 than it was in 1865 when slavery was abolished. So, considering those conditions, how are we to achieve our goals if we don't pacify this white majority? And this is something in particular. Again, I mentioned earlier in this lecture that so much of what is quite visible in not only what Washington and Dubois write, but in particular in this tension between the two of them, so much of it just seems to return from one generation to the next. And this is precisely the conversation that we are having today about how to talk about racial inequity, especially to and with many white individuals who, even when the conversation is raised, become rather defensive and disinclined to even engage in that conversation. How do we do that? How do we navigate that tricky terrain? And you can see someone like Washington attempting to develop perhaps a gentler strategy. Okay, but now I think I want to transition to some of Washington's thoughts about work, because we see a lot of different ideas intersect with this development of work as something not to be derided or frowned upon or thought of as something that only a particular class of individuals do, but work as this metric or this way of showing one's value, but also this way of understanding oneself in the world. And again, there are so many wonderful examples from the text, just excellent quotes that illustrate Washington's feelings about work. But I think what I want to do is focus on what he says on 715. I'm near maybe the middle to bottom of the page. In later years, I confess that I do not envy the white boys as I once did. I have learned that success is to be measured not so much by the position that one has reached in life as by the obstacles which he has overcome while trying to succeed. Looked at from this standpoint, I almost reach the conclusion that often the Negro boy's birth and connection with an unpopular race is an advantage, so far as real life is concerned. With few exceptions, the Negro youth must work harder and must perform his task even better than a white youth in order to secure recognition. But out of the hard and unusual struggle through which he is compelled to pass, he gets a strength, a confidence that one misses, whose pathway is comparatively smooth by reason of birth and race. So, a couple of different ideas, again, intersect here. Some of them are perhaps a bit complicated, I think, and I'll just start with what's complicated. It is not hard to read, or it is not hard to come to the conclusion that Washington, whether he intends to or not, and I think this is important, endorses and celebrates what his race experienced in this country. Because he does write, I almost reach the conclusion that often the Negro boy's birth in connection with an unpopular race is an advantage. It certainly does feel like and he's being rhetorical, of course, but I think one could read this as, again, perhaps not intentional, as an endorsement of racial inequality. Hey, if you have, according to Washington, certain obstacles in your way, well, that's a good thing. It builds character. And I think we broadly understand that's true. But the difference that, and many of my students like to mention this, there's a difference between obstacles that are placed in your way because of racism, hate, etc., and obstacles that just naturally exist. That's not the same thing, but Washington doesn't always make that distinction. But what he does say here that I think a lot of my students like is this idea that it is not what you are from a racial perspective that defines your worth. Your worth is understood through and by what you do. And for those individuals who are in a more advantageous position, perhaps because of birth, race, status, those individuals who are quite fortunate, according to Washington, their situation is actually worse as an individual because they'll never know the joy of actually working for something with all of the myriad of different obstacles that some less fortunate individuals have. That, sure, they might experience success, but it's almost as if Washington wants to suggest their inherent or the advantages they have simply because of perhaps their race or their family, that perhaps cheapens their accomplishments a bit. And this is really quite interesting because you can see here Washington celebrating the accomplishments of not just the former black slave, but in particular, any black individual who experiences success, because according to Washington, their obstacles were and are far greater than the obstacles their non-black contemporaries faced. And I think the last thing I want to say regarding Washington before I transition to Dubois is what he wrote and what he said in what figures like Dubois later described as the 1895 Atlanta Compromise. And I think this is giving us perhaps the clearest, most distilled sense of what this incrementalism, or again, if you are not as favorable to a figure like Washington, what this accommodationism looks like. And I'm here on page 723. This is the middle of the page. I believe it is the duty of the Negro, as the greater part of the race is already doing, to deport himself modestly in regard to political claims, depending upon the slow but sure influences that proceed from the possession of property, intelligence, and high character for the full recognition of his political rights. I think that the according of the full exercise of political rights is going to be a matter of natural, slow growth, not an overnight, ground vine affair. I do not believe that the Negro should cease voting, for a man cannot learn the exercise of self-government by ceasing to vote any more than a boy can learn to swim by keeping out of the water. But I do believe that in his voting he should more and more be influenced by those of intelligence and character who are his next-door neighbors. So I think what we see Washington suggesting here, again, notice this emphasis on possession of property. That is the first thing he lists, the possession of property, intelligence, and high character for the full recognition of his political rights. This, for at least him, this acknowledgement or this interpretation that for equality to become real in the world, certain standards must be met among his black community or the black community. And one of those, again, for someone like Washington, it's about the importance of material success, the importance of the presence of work, and work that will then create the conditions for generational wealth and generational success. Again, this movement up. But with the language that I just read, you could also get this sense that, in particular, when he says, influenced by those of intelligence and character who are his next-door neighbors. Now, perhaps he's speaking about, for any single black individual, their black neighbors, but he doesn't qualify it in that way. So there is also potentially this sense that for this to happen, for the black race to fully realize equality, racial equality, it's not enough to do it on our own. In fact, someone like Washington seems quite skeptical of the idea that it's anything the black community could do on their own. They need, whether they want it or not, the endorsement of the white majority. And once again, I'll leave it to you to decide how you ultimately feel about this. Is Washington just behaving pragmatically, or is he missing something? And if he's missing something, what is it? And perhaps Du Bois has an answer to that. So now it might be, and again, I know that was something of a quick reading and a quick analysis of Up From Slavery. There's so much more I could say, but for time consideration, I want to transition to Du Bois. So I mentioned earlier that Du Bois's text, The Souls of Black Folk, feels a lot different from Washington's because he's attempting to do something, at least from a genre perspective, that's quite different from what Washington attempts to do. This is not necessarily a first-person narrative explanation of the horrors of slavery, because that's not something Du Bois experienced. Unlike Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois was never a slave. He was not born into slavery. He was born in the North. So his relationship to some of the concerns that Washington mentions and explicates is a bit different. But of course, that's not to say that Du Bois was separated from or ignorant of the concerns, the narratives, and the plight of former slaves, because he certainly was. And I think one of the ways that we see this is in that chapter on what are called sorrow songs, or the sorts of songs, the songs that slaves would sing on plantations. So much, and again, Du Bois feels more like a sociologist than anything else, maybe even a kind of cultural anthropologist, because he really wants to excavate and present to his reader information and totems regarding slavery, but in particular what slaves did in an attempt to survive. Again, he's attempting to write not only about his contemporary moment, but he's doing that kind of sociological, anthropological work to show a reader this history in its most striking and vivid detail imaginable. And of course, he does that in other works as well. He has a wonderful book on the failures of Reconstruction, but he asks this question here at the beginning on page 921 that I think is quite interesting, and it certainly guides his exploration throughout this text. And it's a simple enough question, quote, and this is on 921, how does it feel to be a problem? And for someone like Du Bois, this is such an important concept to understand, that for him, to be black is to be a problem in a predominantly white hegemonic culture. And part of what he tries to do, especially early in this text, he introduces and develops these terms and concepts that explain the consequences of being a problem. And the first is this notion of a veil. And he writes this on 921 and 922. Then it dawned upon me with a certain suddenness that I was different from the others, or like mayhap in heart and life and longing, but shut out from their world by a vast veil. I had thereafter no desire to tear down that veil, to creep through it. I held all beyond it in common contempt, and lived above it in a region of blue sky and great wandering shadows. So this contrast to how Du Bois feels about the exclusion that happens as a result of this veil, and how Washington feels, it's quite striking. Because with someone like Du Bois, we see far less charity and far less understanding. But the second concept, and this is perhaps the more important concept, or the one that people really like to think about and talk about, is double consciousness, this internalizing of one's oppression, or perhaps another way of saying that is seeing oneself through another or the other. And I have a couple of quotes here I'll read. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. And he simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. And finally, here in America, in the few days since emancipation, the black man's turning hither and thither in hesitant and doubtful striving has often made his very strength to lose effectiveness, to seem like absence of power, like weakness. And yet it is not weakness. It is the contradiction of double aims. So what I think Du Bois is getting at with this notion of double consciousness, and I think it's best exemplified in this sense of two-ness, not having or experiencing the privilege of a unified identity. For someone like Du Bois, he seems to argue or suggest that to be a person of color in the United States is to have this feeling or sense of discontinuity with yourself, perhaps emotionally, psychologically. And for someone like Du Bois, that's all filtered, again, through this sense that to be black is to be a problem. And he seems to argue or suggest that at some point, that sense that you're a problem is an idea that you internalize. And because of that, it produces this discontinuity, this, quote, warring in oneself, for oneself, that becomes quite impossible to reconcile. And I think part of the tragedy here is this, as he suggests, attempt to satisfy, quote, two unreconciled ideals, which is another way of saying this feeling or this drive that you have two paths that you want to travel. They can't agree with one another. Yet, as contradictory as it sounds, as a black individual, according to Du Bois, you are attempting to satisfy both of those drives, or you are driven to satisfy both of those paths, even though they never cross, they never intersect, they remain forever separate. And again, I think there is this clear sense of tragedy with this idea, or with this notion that, according to Du Bois, this is what not just slavery, but the unmistakable racism that underpins and undergirds not just slavery, but everything that happened after, produces. But another clear distinction, perhaps, between Washington and Du Bois is how they understand and conceptualize what education looks like. Because, and I didn't necessarily speak about this a lot when I spoke about Washington, but I think with someone like Washington, there's this sense, and again, they are not mutually exclusive. I think that's important. But for someone like Washington, education, again, the drive or the telos or the larger goal is about work, material possessions, material accumulation as a way, again, of creating the conditions for equality. Therefore, his concept of work feels more professional. It's we would perhaps today use language like he's more interested in teaching trades and skills. But someone like Du Bois, his concept feels more like what we associate in the liberal arts. He's more interested in abstract philosophical concepts and the kind of education that produces the cultivation of abstract philosophic concepts. This, for example, is on page 926. The training of the schools we need today more than ever, the training of deft hands, quick eyes and ears, and above all, the broader, deeper, higher culture of gifted minds and pure hearts, the power of the ballot we need in sheer self-defense, else what shall save us from a second slavery? Freedom, too, the long sought we still seek, the freedom of life and limb, the freedom to work and think, the freedom to love and aspire, work, culture, liberty, all these we need, not singly, but together, not successively, but together, each growing and aiding each, and all striving toward the vaster ideal that swims before the Negro people, the ideal of human brotherhood gained through the unifying ideal of race, the ideal of fostering and developing the traits and talents of the Negro, not in the oppression to our contempt for other races, but rather in large conformity to the greater ideals of the American Republic, in order that someday on American soil, two world races may give each to each those characteristics both so sadly lack. And this emphasis, and again, you'll notice how he qualifies this a bit. Sure, we need schools that teach people how to use their hands, their eyes, and their ears deftly, but he also says we need higher culture, gifted minds, pure hearts. And these are the kinds of qualities and characteristics that classes like this, for example, aspire to cultivate in people and students. Then, for example, if we look on 929, in the North, the feeling has several times forced itself into words that Mr. Washington's counsels of submission overlooked certain elements of true manhood and that his educational program was unnecessarily narrow. Usually, however, such criticism has not found open expression, although, too, the spiritual sons of the abolitionists have not been prepared to acknowledge that the schools founded before Tuskegee by men of broad ideals and self-sacrificing spirits were wholly failures or worthy of ridicule. While then criticism has not failed to follow Mr. Washington, yet the prevailing public opinion of the land has been but too willing to deliver the solution of a wearisome problem into his hands and say, if that is all you and your race ask, take it. So I think, again, part of what we're seeing here, and we see this in Dubois's critique of Washington's accommodationism. He would describe it as accommodationism, but we also see it in his critique of how Washington understands what education should be. This sense, or again, there's this clear sense that it's all too narrow. And because it's all too narrow, it has perhaps for someone like Du Bois, this effect of suggesting or revealing a kind of narrowness at the core of Black people. And for someone like Du Bois, again, he's far more ambitious and he's far more vocal about those ambitions, not nearly as incrementalist or accommodationist, he would perhaps say, as a figure like Washington. And I think perhaps the last thing I'll say, I won't talk a lot about the chapter on sorrow songs, even though I would encourage you to read it, because I think for someone like Du Bois, it's this celebration of not just the songs themselves, but as I mentioned earlier, the voices that produce them, this celebration of, quote, the voice of exile, which in many ways is a kind of voice of excess. And that's something that Du Bois seems to like and celebrate. And it's just a beautiful chapter, and it's a lovely literary analysis of not just particular particular sorrow songs, but just the whole genre itself that slaves produced. And again, this celebration of the slave voice, quote, the voice of exile. And I think I'll just mention one more quote about sorrow songs. Quote, "These songs are of an unhappy people, of the children of disappointment. They tell of death and suffering and unvoiced longing toward a truer world." Again, I think for someone like Dubois, not just the way these songs sound, but the moxie to even produce them, which is to say, just how bold these voices of exile were. And also just how intelligent they were, because so many of these sorrow songs are covert. It's not like they're necessarily as transparent as you would think. It's all coded, which I think for someone like Dubois, that's part of the literary quality and literary merit of them. They are songs with codes, or there are encoded messages, and he seems to not only like but celebrate that. So, okay, I knew this would be a bit of a longer lecture. Thank you so much for listening to the end, but I think that is where I will stop. Again, this question of whose approach do we think might yield the best results? This was not something that was exclusive to Washington and Du Bois. In many ways, it existed long before them. Even a figure like Frederick Douglass, his trajectory as an abolitionist figure followed a similar, not necessarily a similar sort of path. It was actually in reverse, but there was this clear tension between these two poles. But this is something that was quite visible perhaps during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. And again, I think even today we are having a similar sort of conversation about how do we talk about racial inequality? How do we talk in particular to a white majority that perhaps doesn't want to have these conversations or is reticent to having these conversations? So this is yet one of those moments where something particular happened in American literary history, but it has this universal or almost omnipresent quality. We keep coming back to it, and perhaps that's regrettable that it's something that we keep returning to, because that suggests we haven't resolved this problem. So even though these were figures and voices of the late 19th and early 20th century, their voices are still quite loud and quite present today. So I think that's where I will stop. Again, this is Colin Cox for Early American Literature, and I look forward to speaking to you next week.